Well, hey guys, today we're going to be looking at Standard 8.3, which is about Vietnam. This is very much in the same time period of what we've been talking about with Nixon and President Johnson. So if we put it there mentally, I think we'll be kind of okay. This is sort of long, so let's jump into it, and we'll see how this goes. If you have any questions, be sure you reach out. I do want to mention in the notes that I'm using this year, you'll see that there's a chunk at the beginning where I've kind of summarized some things. And it actually says if you want the full version, you can get them on the website. So be aware of that. If there's some things here that aren't on the paper, don't be surprised. So let's dive in and let's talk a little bit about how in the world we get involved in Vietnam. Vietnam for a number of years was controlled by the French. They used it as a colony. They got a lot of resources from there. And so think about it kind of like the way that the United States was when the British were controlling us. We didn't like that, and neither did the Vietnamese. One guy in particular, this guy up here in the upper right-hand corner, this is Ho Chi Minh. While he's studying, while he's in school, he reads some Karl Marx, reads communism, and of course, communism talks about how the people should have the power, not the government, not anybody else, not the wealthy, not some far-off country that's colonized you with the people. And so he loves this idea, becomes a communist, he comes back to Vietnam, and he teaches lots of other Vietnamese about communism. So together they rise up and they try to stop the French, try to break out from under their rule. And because at the time the United States has a policy of containment, we say we don't want communism to spread, so we're going to spend lots and lots of money to keep that from happening. The French pretty quickly end up being defeated and they pull out. And there's an agreement between the communist Vietnamese, who are primarily in the north, and the more democratic Vietnamese in the south, that they're not going to fight. There's an agreement in Geneva, Switzerland, we call them the Geneva Accords, that there will be a line here at the 17th parallel, and they'll just hold there. Nobody will move across the line. Nobody will attack until elections can be held. But pretty much everybody knows that based on the numbers, the North is going to win, and Ho Chi Minh will lead the country to communism. Again, our containment theory says that can't happen. We believe in this idea that we call the domino theory. If one country in Asia falls, there are lots of other countries around it that might also become communist, and so that makes us double down on our desire to contain communism. Because of this knowledge, South Korea basically decides we're not going to even have this election, and Eisenhower in the 1950s says, yep, great plan, we're going to go ahead and do that, and we're going to continue to give the president of South Vietnam lots of money so he can fight against the North. Of course, this is going to lead to a resistance movement, and we call the communists who are in South Vietnam, remember South Vietnam is the democratic portion in theory, but there are still communists there, we call them the Viet Cong. And these guys are basically trying to resist the South Vietnamese government. They would love to see communism happen, and as we get more and more involved in Vietnam, that this group is going to be more and more active and more violent. When Kennedy takes the presidency in the early 1960s, he continues the policy of military aid in Vietnam, and he really wants to make sure communism doesn't spread. And so he sends some advisors to help the Vietnamese better train their troops, better think about how to stand up against the North. The problem with all this is that the South Vietnamese government keeps taking our money, but they don't necessarily use it on the things we would hope they would. The president, for example, suddenly builds a big house, buys fancier cars, and a number of the people in his cabinet do the same. And so we're like, what's going on here? In addition, he doesn't really do what the people want him to do. Here in this picture, you may have seen this before, and you're thinking, what does this have to do with anything? Well, Diem, who's the president of South Vietnam, is a Catholic. And he decides he's going to crack down on other religions in Vietnam, including the Buddhists. So he would kind of very quietly use the military or the police to arrest a number of vocal Vietnamese, Buddhists, well, Vietnamese Buddhists. Some of them just disappear, some of them even end up dead, and it's all done very quietly. So if you ever see this picture, there are a number of monks who decide we have to do something. This man in particular goes into a crowded marketplace, he douses himself in gasoline, and he sets himself on fire, knowing the news will pick this up. People will want to know, why did he do this? And the reason he did it is in protest to the Vietnamese government, which is corrupt and isn't doing what we would hope. So the United States government is trying to figure out, what do we do about this? And basically we make the decision that the CIA will kind of lead an insurrection against this Vietnamese government, the South Vietnamese government. And in the middle of it, their president is assassinated. Just a couple months later, JFK is assassinated, and this kind of gives us a fresh restart for a lot of things happening in Vietnam. In fact, this is where your notes sort of start in earnest, so make sure you are following along here. So Johnson immediately becomes president at the death of JFK, or at least within a couple hours, and he continues JFK's policies. Money, advisors, that's going to be fine. The problem is that just a couple months into this, or into Johnson's presidency, an American ship is attacked in what we call the Gulf of Tonkin. This, of course, sets our troops and sets our military on high alert. They say, all right, be aware of what might happen in the days to come. Well, sure enough, just a few days later, a ship is again in the Gulf of Tonkin, and the radar shows that it's coming under attack. And so, frantic radio calls are made in, and there's a firing back at this other ship that's showing up on the radar in response. And Congress says, well, if the North Vietnamese are going to attack us, we had better authorize Johnson to send troops to fight back, to better defend ourselves. So Congress passes what they call the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which doesn't declare war on Vietnam, but it gives Johnson the power to use military force without authorization from Congress. So he can send troops even though we haven't declared war. Now, it's kind of important to point this out. We learned later on that second engagement where our radar shows that we're coming under attack is definitely a radar equipment malfunction of some sort. It's pretty quick that Congress and even the president himself realize this, but it seems like we really want to show that Johnson is not soft on communism. And so the Tonkin Gulf Resolution stands, even though it was passed for kind of purposes that weren't legitimate. Congress never does declare war on Vietnam, and this is going to kind of continue all throughout the time that we're there. Now, a second ago I mentioned this whole idea of being soft on communism. If you remember the Red Scare, Joseph McCarthy, there's this idea that he promotes that the Republicans are the only ones who are tough on communism, therefore you should vote for Democrats. This is just a couple years later, and Johnson doesn't want to look like he's weak on communism, so of course we're going to step up involvement. Specifically, by 1967, Johnson sends 500,000 troops to Vietnam and pretty quickly starts a massive bombing campaign on North Vietnam. Now, as you would imagine, when we're sending lots of troops, and in fact we're even going to have a draft, there are people who say, why are we involved in a war on the other side of the world when the people we're fighting against, they want their country to be communist. We're trying to stop it from spreading, but so many people over there want it that a democratic election would point them to communism. And so this escalation of an anti-war movement is going to grow. You'll see lots of protests, which we'll talk about in a minute. Some of the protest music from the 60s and 70s is directly a result of this. One of the issues at the heart of the anti-war movement is that people start to notice that Vietnam is kind of a poor man's fight. Rich people have friends who are doctors, and so they can get, he has flat feet, he has asthma, he has bad eyesight. And so they have these notes that they're able to give that get them out of the military, or college deferments. If you're in college and you get drafted, they would say, well, we're gonna defer your drafting until you're done with college. So you can stick around and get a master's degree or some more education. You can just kind of bide your time until the war is over, in theory. Well, the question, though, is who goes to college? People that have a little bit of money tend to go to college, and poorer people have a more difficult time. So, again, there's some inequality. Some rich people, because of their connections, are able to get into the National Guard, which lots of people wanted to get into and tried to get into. So what they're saying is, I know I'm going to get called into the military. I'll just sign up and I'll serve here, right? I'll fly around South Carolina and make sure it doesn't get attacked. And in addition to this, we'll see that African Americans serve in very large numbers as ground troops, again, because of some of these historical inequalities, right? Where African Americans they don't have the same generational wealth in many cases, because some of the generational wealth of white people goes way back into, in some cases, the 1700s or even before. So because of this, you'll see lots of protest, and even some soldiers will come back and they will join the protests. This is what you see in Forrest Gump, right? I know Forrest Gump isn't intentionally protesting, but the idea that somebody wearing a uniform would speak out against the war in that film makes a lot of sense. Pictures like this, the guy putting the daisy into the barrel of the gun of the National Guard who are trying to break up a protest. TV cameras pick up pictures of people who are burning their draft cards. Some of the protests get rowdy, and there are war slogan or anti-government slogans that they're chanting. And a lot of people say, I don't like that. We should support the government. This is going to lead to a pretty sharp division between what we call the hawks, the more pro-war faction in the country, and the doves, the people who say we don't have any business being in war. You may know that, but it's something you should be able to differentiate between. Things are really going to sour pretty quickly for the Johnson administration. There is one event in particular during a Vietnamese holiday called Tet. Think of it sort of like Christmas in that it's supposed to be peaceful and calm. There's actually a ceasefire that's called for this holiday so that both sides can be with family and they can, just kind of relax. But despite this ceasefire, the North Vietnamese cross into the South Territory and our territory, and they attack. And this makes us really question, do we understand the rules? Do we understand our enemy? Maybe we don't. And if we don't, what are we doing there? And so the public more and more starts to side with the doves. And it's really around this point that Johnson, who you see in this picture, decides, I don't want to run for another term. Nixon is going to be elected in 1968, largely because he promises to win the war. The catch is that he decides when he takes the presidency, he's going to try to win it through sort of a different means and sort of slowly pull us out. And so, of course, since we don't pull out immediately, these protests do continue, and there's actually a huge peace march in Washington. Again, I mentioned Forrest Gump. This is their version of the peace march, which is pretty similar to the real thing. Nixon tries a policy of Vietnamization, which is basically we're going to replace American troops with South Vietnamese. We're going to train them, we're going to equip them, and that way we don't have to worry about our troops going and fighting at the same degree as we were, right? Hand it off to the people who are responsible for the defense of their own country. While he does that, Nixon ends the draft. We don't need as many soldiers, and the protests are going to die down. But then he decides that we're going to actually start attacking a new place in near Vietnam in Southeast Asia. Specifically, it's this area right here. Remember we mentioned the Viet Cong? Those are the South Vietnamese communists. Well, they have to get their supplies from the north, but there's no way the north is going to travel all the way down South Vietnamese territory. So instead, they come out here into Laos in Cambodia, and they cut into the country. We call this route the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And Nixon says we need to stop those supply routes, and so he starts bombing them. That makes a lot of sense, except for the fact that he's now bombing two brand new countries. We're bombing Laos and Cambodia, which isn't extremely popular. And when people find out that this is happening, even though we're being told, right, no, we're actually winding down the war, the protests start back up again. The protests are pretty ugly. There's actually one in particular in Ohio at a place called Kent State University where there's a protest and the National Guard is called out. And 4 of the protesters are shot by the National Guard. They're not supposed to shoot, but somebody has an itchy trigger finger. How many times have we used that phrase in U.S. history? And as a result, 4 college students are killed. You can imagine this is not something that makes the war more popular. In fact, now we're questioning what are we doing to a new degree. Nixon decides at this point, okay, what else can we do to maybe help the South Vietnamese when we inevitably pull out? And he says, well, why don't we try to have better relationships with both China and with Russia because they are both communists. They're probably supporting North Vietnam. And so he opens up new relationships with both countries, specifically China, who we haven't even talked to to a great degree since 1949. We call this détente. That is, we're going to relax the tensions that we had with them before. Finally, the night before the 1972 elections, Nixon is running for re-election. He goes on television and he says, "We are bringing the troops home. We're negotiating with the North Vietnamese to bring the prisoners of war back home." Within 3 years, we pull out after that quickly, and we leave it to the South Vietnamese. And the South Vietnamese aren't able to hold it. By 1975, the country's fallen to the north. Vietnam is today unified. It is not North and South. It is one country that is communist. So this idea that we've had of containment hasn't succeeded. It's failed. So what are the outcomes of this? Let's do this quickly, and we'll be out of here. One is that 58,000 American soldiers die and we don't win. That's kind of traumatic for people who grew up in the post-World War II era, where basically if we believed that we had the moral right response, we couldn't lose, right? We beat the Nazis. We thought we should be able to beat them too, and we don't. So we start to question, are we what we thought we were? There are a number of things that make us question what are our values and what are we actually doing. There are stories that come out like the My Lai massacre, which is uniquely bad. This is a village in Vietnam where we learned that there are a lot of insurgents coming from. They're coming out to attack our forces, and so the decision is made to land troops near this village to encircle it and to close in, and as we do, we wipe out about 400 men, women, and children. And there are some pretty graphic stories and images of this. We say, who are we? In addition, in order to fight in the jungle, we decided we're going to spray some chemicals on the trees so that we can better see our enemy. We use Agent Orange, which causes the trees to die, and that's helpful. The problem is that it causes significant birth defects. This right here over on the right is actually one of the least disturbing pictures that you can find on the internet of Agent Orange babies born without just significant body parts. Or napalm. We use a type of, it's a basically petroleum jelly that's sort of infused with gasoline, so it's sticky fire. So if it lands on someone, you can't just run away or stop, drop, and roll, but it continues to burn until it burns out. And it sometimes is used in villages, and there are images of it hitting civilians and children. And again, we're thinking, what are we doing? Lots of stories, things of like fragging, guys who say, I don't want to go out on patrol, and so I'm going to pull the pin out of a grenade and I'm going to throw it into the tent of a commanding officer to kill him so I don't have to go on patrol. Or stories of the drug use that come out from Vietnam, and troops who come back dependent on all kinds of drugs. And a lot of these guys come back from the war and we treat them very poorly. Sometimes because of stories like the My Lai massacre, we would call them, these guys, baby killers. And sure, that is something that happens, but not every person who went to Vietnam is that. In fact, most aren't. So it's hard for a lot of guys who come back from the war to get jobs. They're not respected like we respect veterans today, and it's really difficult. And even today, you find a large number of homeless people who are Vietnam vets. In addition, we just don't trust the government. We realize, remember, Nixon says we're pulling out of Vietnam when actually we're expanding the war into new countries. So we use a term, we call it the credibility gap. That's the gap between what the government says and what we believe. Today, you say, I don't trust the government at all. Well, right. But back in the 1950s, of course we did. What happened in between? And the answer is Vietnam and the credibility gap. It's right on the heels of that we learned that the President of the United States, Richard Nixon, hires some guys that he calls his plumbers to break into the Democratic National Headquarters at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. And think about it this way. What they're looking for is basically, what's the playbook that they're going to run against him in the 1972 campaign? So he wins the 72 campaign. Was it because he knew what they were going to do to try to beat him and he was able to plan in advance? Well, maybe. As a result of this, even though he wins re-election, Nixon is almost impeached and he chooses to resign. One last impact of Vietnam is that the government says we made a huge mistake with the authorization of giving Johnson all these troops without actually declaring war. And so the Tonkin Gulf Resolution is going to be rolled back with something called the War Powers Act that basically says Congress can no longer make war without the president for an extended period of time. If he commits troops, he has to let Congress know within 48 hours, and Congress can pull troops out after 60 days. Guys, I know that's a long section. Thanks for hanging in there. If you have any questions, email me. Let me know how I can help you. Otherwise, have a good one.